and welcome to this next episode of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name is Andrew Knight. I'm the global lead for data and tech within the thought leadership, regulations and standard part of RICS, and my job is to look at the effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. Our 130,000 members work across every territory across the globe, looking at residential, commercial, office, public buildings, infrastructure, every kind of asset type you can imagine, and they work right across the life cycle of buildings, from land acquisition through development, construction, brokerage, valuation, and critically operations of buildings. So it's a very, very broad church in terms of how data and tech is bringing value to the profession. And I'm really, really happy this afternoon to have Hermione with me from Purrmetrix. So please join me, Hermione.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
Hi. Glad to have you on board. And I always ask all our tech partners that in some respects, the bits and bytes are interesting, but I'm almost as interested in the kind of background and the teams of the skills and experience that have brought these companies to the fore. So my first question is really a bit of a backstory about you and your colleagues and the history of Purrmetrix and the kind of skills and experience you bring to your operation.
The full origin story. Okay.
Yeah.
How long have you got? So I am what is probably best described as a recovering chartered surveyor. I did my APC about 25 years ago.
All right.
Having done a degree in surveying before that, obviously, and we practiced in the West End, sort of both in sort of asset management and also in agency for about 4 or 5 years. And then I decided that really core sort of surveying was probably not for me, and moved over to the tech sector in Cambridge, which is where I was living at the time, and had a really interesting sort of decade or so working in the tech sector, and in particular looking at the development of smart metering and smart grid technologies, which just at the stage where they were beginning to become adopted worldwide, and the demand for both new methods of collecting data and for actually making sense of that data was really beginning to take off. But there was always an itch in the back of my head about the fact that you could see the sort of impact of energy efficiency in buildings, and the interest in energy efficiency in buildings was growing, but there was perhaps, you know, not so much understanding about the performance of buildings, and particularly missing seemed to be an understanding of what the energy was delivering in terms of the comfort and the productive spaces that you would look for in any building. So I was talking to a few of my colleagues in the sector and my friends in the sector about this for quite a while, and we eventually decided that it would be really very interesting to try and develop a business around the idea of how do you measure the performance of commercial and domestic buildings, who's going to make any value out of doing that, and how do you relate that to the energy efficiency in buildings, and that's really the genesis of Purrmetrix, which was about 6 years ago now. So that's how we got started. That's the origin story.
So it's interesting because my next question is going to sound a bit of a kind of a 101 question, because you talk there about the challenges of really kind of linking some of these measurements, and obviously, you know, RICS, you know, our magazine is called Modus Latin for measurement. Our profession is all about measurement, but how do you actually measure the performance of buildings? Because you've got two words there, measure and performance, and clearly performance is quite open to interpretation, isn't it, in terms of what people want out of an asset?
Yes, very much so. And this is why when I talk about what we deliver, I talk about a tool set rather than necessarily a particular process or a prescriptive set of solutions, because what you need from a building at its basics is, of course, it's a comfortable and productive space and a healthy space to live in. How you drive that down into actual measurements really somewhat varies depending upon the type of building that you're looking at and the use that you're putting it to. So, for example, it's a very different kettle of fish looking at the fabric of a home or house, so that you can decide what you want to do in retrofit perspectives, to understanding in a large commercial building how effective the ventilation is for protecting against aerosol and health-related issues. But there are different, there are now measurements or measurement approaches for a lot of the things that you would want to measure about the performance of a building. And at the core of it, there's a recognition that providing a good IAQ and internal air quality for most buildings is a fundamental thing that a building should be doing. And that's, I think, a relatively straightforward thing to capture data around. The more challenging thing is then filtering that data and turning it into useful metrics. Otherwise, people just drown in a sea of IAQ data.
Exactly, and I suppose that almost leads to my next question about, how do you evaluate then? You've got raw material coming in terms of data. How do you, that classic thing, how do you turn data into information, and then how do you then evaluate what to do with it all? Because I suppose there's a danger with some incredibly smart buildings. And I remember when the Edge building in the Netherlands first sort of came on stream, they had more data than they could absorb or knew what to do with in terms of movements of people, air quality, temperatures, all these various things. They were swamped by data, and it was data almost without value in that. So what does evaluation look like when you've got all these various data?
The whole industry is on this journey, Andrew, and it's really been very interesting to look at what's happened from, say, 5 years ago, when having basic visualization tools was helpful, because a good visualization tool will allow you to absorb a lot more data. Now people are much more interested in taking that and turning it into some specific metrics, and how you derive those metrics is very often informed by an understanding of building physics. So if you're looking at, for example, a heat loss measurement, what you are essentially trying to do there is you're trying to develop a model of, or an understanding of a building that will take an energy and energy input, temperature inputs from internal and external over a period of time to deliver the heat transfer coefficient. But that's informed by a physics-based model, and there's a lot of work that needs to go into, I think, delivering some key metrics that are in effect shorthands for the performance of buildings. And we're still really in the very foothills of finding out what those metrics should be. Particularly for housing, I think there's a core set that is already fairly, people are talking about. For commercial buildings, I think there's probably quite a lot more that can be done, and it will be very interesting to see how facilities managers, who I think probably have a driving interest in this, will be able to sort of direct that going into the future.
So, I mean, I suppose in some respects it's an obvious question about why this whole area has become more mainstream. But I mean, there are presumably a number of drivers, but why are people perhaps more aware than this? I mean, is it because the technology is available to do the measurement, or has there been a change in thinking in certain sectors about what buildings mean for people?
There are a lot of drivers. Yes, the technology has become available, and it's not just about sensors, although a lot of what we've been doing in terms of the product development is developing a solution that is appropriate for I suppose the non-smart buildings. Because the interest obviously is in the Edge and everybody's shiny headquarters buildings in Mayfair will have a lot of this data already in it, and it will already be reporting back. But the 80–90% of houses and people's branch offices in Slough will still need some degree of measurement. So that's the hardware to do that, and to allow people to take the tool set to allow people to take that is been made much easier by the development in sensor technology and the reduction in data carry costs and all of those good things that have been going on in the past 5 years. But just as interestingly, of course, is the development of the data science that goes over the top of that, and the understanding of how to apply building physics to make a sensible measurement, and then perhaps to benchmark against other buildings. So I've slightly forgotten where we came in with this, but that's one of the drivers.
It was a number of drivers, and I suppose, I mean, you've already mentioned facilities managers, who are obviously clearly very much at the kind of sharp end of that, if I can use that expression, and obviously many of our RICS members are in that sort of particular function as well. But more broadly for the surveying profession, what does this mean? I mean, that's a very open, grand question, but if you as you're talking to the members here, what should they be thinking in terms of their role and relevance and the implications for what they do as a profession? Because think of the building surveyors, they're in and out of buildings all the time, and clearly there's now much more focus on that performance aspect, as opposed to just, is it, what's the condition? Is it falling down? Is there damp? Are there classic issues in terms of preventative maintenance? So what does it mean from your perspective to our profession?
Well, it kind of relates back to the question you just asked me about, why are people taking more interest in this? And I think the reason is that there are several different pressures arising. COVID's made us all think about how much buildings contribute to our health, and how these spaces should be protecting our health. We're all very well aware of the contribution that buildings make to our carbon footprint in the UK, and the need to reduce that. And because of those two factors, and a number of other things, people are beginning to develop an interest in understanding how buildings really, I suppose, perform is the best way I can put on it. And so, because they're beginning to see a building almost as a service. The delivery of a comfortable space and a productive space is kind of part of a service that a building should be providing. And over time, I think this becomes additional data that will be used to judge the value of what is being delivered in a building. For as you say, the sectors that are at the sharp end of this are people in building surveying, people who are doing energy assessments in particular, because that's going to become probably moved more towards measurement over the next couple of years. And people who are in charge of day-to-day operations in the sort of facilities field, because they're going to be fielding using the data most immediately. But I think there's a roadmap here where being able to provide measurements and metrics for validation really builds into people's perception of the performance of the building, and eventually into the perception of the value of the building. You can actually see it already in housing, where outside the sort of southeast bubble, there is a relationship between EPC ratings and housing value. So it's not a fanciful idea to think that once you can take proper measurements of what a building is provided, it affects people's perception of the value of the space.
Indeed, and it's obviously hard to avoid, perhaps debate is the wrong word, but the whole visibility of the ESG agenda. And certainly I know from talking to many sort of market participants, particularly the large asset managers thinking about perhaps commercial real estate particularly, that there seems to be an uneasiness, I suppose, linked back to that valuation question, that large asset managers still don't have the information they want to have, which increasingly they'll need for reporting purposes, leaving aside the fact that you want assets to perform well, to be attractive, to command good rents and all that sort of stuff. There just seems to be a huge dearth of available information, and sometimes it almost starts off with the basics that people don't even really know how big their buildings are or what they're made of, and then without that, as you say, back to almost the basic building pathology and the basic physics, how can you make assessments when you're not sure the size of the floor plate or how many people are in there, or how much glass it's got, all those kind of things. So what do you see ESG doing from your conversations?
Well, that also is complicated by the fact, of course, that buildings' performance drifts over time. So that, never mind the performance gap that one sees when a building comes out of the ground, which is a well discussed phenomenon over every year. I've seen US studies that suggest every year a building will typically consume about 5% more energy than the year before, purely because this is a commercial building, because various adjustments have been made to building controls and not necessarily put back in the most efficient way possible. So, to take a regular heartbeat, if you like, of what is going on in a building, what's being delivered for that increased energy consumption is a useful recommissioning exercise, if nothing else. The ESG agenda is very interesting because I think I see quite a bit that is influenced by what can be measured. So currently, a lot of the metrics are quite rightly extremely focused around data, energy consumption data. And with my smart metering background, I'm very pleased to see that. But you do have to bear in mind, of course, that the lowest consumption buildings are the buildings that are providing no heat and no air conditioning at all.
Yeah, and are very uncomfortable and unproductive. Yeah.
Yes. So I think there is an evolutionary step necessary towards being able to understand the trade-off between the efficiency or the energy consumption, more accurately, and the environment that's being produced. And that's really where the ability to produce some sensible metrics of performance come in.
Yeah, no, and I suppose you raise a couple of interesting points there, which is that that challenge, I think, dare I say it, to certain existing sort of certifications which measure the kind of, as of now, theoretical performance, and then either that drift, as you say, or the fact that actually a building that's been well constructed and designed and built may not be operated very well. So you do get that classic performance gap coming in. And I guess that other issue.
There are standards like BREEAM and WELL that take into account the well-being of the occupants and are very effective at balancing that. And I think those are probably the flagships or the markers for where these sorts of reporting should go.
Exactly. And also you say that trade-off factor, that I'm sure we've all suffered that, the syndrome of going into the office first thing on a Monday morning and it hasn't been heated all weekend, and you think, would it have been more effective just to keep it ticking over rather than us all sitting here for the first 2 hours on Monday morning? I know my wife works in a school, and every Monday morning in the winter it's that, right, well, the heating's been off the whole weekend and everybody's shivering for the first 2 or 3 hours. So performance means different things to different people, and as you say, it's trade-offs. It's not a sort of a binary save money by turning everything off. There's got to be that trade-off there. So one thing that's also interesting, I think, because we've also kind of touched on it by talking about residential and commercial, but performance, once again, is so critically based on the purpose of the building. What kind of different stories can you tell us about your work across these different asset types? Because we've got schools, hospitals, public buildings, universities, offices, residential homes. They're all very different in terms of what people expect from them, and indeed the limitations of how you can keep doors shut when you can't necessarily on a university where doors are open all the time and air's coming in and out. They're very different, aren't they?
It's very interesting because it's a story of what are the bigger social agendas and indeed economic agendas that are playing out in different sectors. So a good deal of the work that we have been doing sort of in the past 3 to 4 years have been in commercial buildings and particularly offices. And in that areas, we've been looking at the relationship between IAQ and productivity. We've also been looking at the relationship between what you can tell from IAQ about wasted energy. So talk to me about building controls and places that are being conditioned over the weekend and all those exciting. Because that's a very real problem.
Yeah,
The degree to which buildings are commissioned is, the degree to which buildings are flexed in order to support their existing operations, and perhaps their services don't match their operations in a way that
yeah,
is particularly. And it's a great sector to be in, that one, actually, because for some very quick and easy adjustments, you can make some very significant
yeah,
changes to the energy consumption. So that's a sort of classic bread and butter situation for us for quite a few years, and it's been driven by more sort of building owners and occupiers who are more conscious of their energy footprint, but who are also conscious of wanting to provide a good environment for their workforce. So that's one. But at the other end of the scale right now, there is, of course, a lot going on in housing around retrofit and
mm,
insulation, and particularly in social housing.
mm,
And in social housing, the questions are around being able to produce a good set of measurements um, that will benchmark any improvements that you're going to see from the investment you're going to make in
yeah,
retrofit. And those speak not just to energy efficiency. Heat loss is
mm,
definitely one for accessing energy efficiency, but they also speak to dealing with health,
mm,
and dealing with fuel poverty, and dealing with just have some people being able to be comfortable in their own homes. And it's been quite an eye opener,
mm.
um, just how just how much work is needed really in the UK's housing stock. So I think it's a very overdue set of policies that are coming along, but we're very much looking forward to doing more work in that area.
No, as you say, and it's a huge issue, and I suppose there's always a danger we kind of focus on commercial real estate, and yet the scale of the value and the impact, as you say, from a social perspective, from the residential stock is enormous, and almost an order of magnitude bigger in some respects if you think of those societal impacts. So, and clearly, as you know, the number of properties that need to be raised in terms of EPC rating in that residential stock is an eye-watering number in terms of the amount of activity, and presumably data will need to understand the right kind of interventions. So
Well,
you've
yeah,
talked,
that's
I
it.
mean,
And actually, the EPC is a very classic case of rather like the ESG
mm,
criteria we were talking about earlier on. The EPC is a classic case of a sort of process and a tool that is going to be evolved by using measured data rather than relying on
mm,
models.
yeah,
You look at, I think it's the Better Building Partnerships have a really fun graph of 200 commercial buildings with their EPCs related to their actual energy
yeah.
consumption. And it turns out there's very little relationship,
Yes,
sadly.
yes, the correlation's not very strong, is it? I think I've seen a similar. I've seen the same graph. I think it isn't a great advert in that respect, is it? So, but I suppose it just makes the case again for that constant vigilance, almost, that you need to keep measuring. That you can't assume that a building is performing either like it did last year or to a base sort of regime that was done X years ago. These things are living, breathing assets, and I suppose it's always it's hard to avoid COVID. It's the slight elephant in the room in a lot of these conversations, but clearly what people use offices for now is changing, and therefore the occupancy rates are changing. And once again, I guess that's going to be a challenge where there's going to be more hybrid working, less people in the office, change of footprint in terms of perhaps more collaborative spaces. That's going to challenge building operators again to say, well, actually, how do we run these buildings where perhaps the physical utilization is going to look very different, even if they don't reduce the footplate, as it were.
Yeah.
That it's going to be a challenge, isn't it?
But this is nothing new. The way in which we use buildings has obviously always been
Mm,
evolving. I think it's at a very interesting inflection in terms of scale of and the impact across
mm,
very different sectors. But if you look back, you know, I suppose 20 years ago when I was sort of working in surveying, people were talking a lot about moving out of the centre of towns and moving into, you know, different styles of office buildings on the edge of, you know, in office parks, and that was the big new thing. What hasn't changed is what we need buildings to deliver. You know, we need them to deliver a healthy and productive space, and that is always struck me as interesting that that is never really factored into the way that we it's very tangentially factored into the way that we value buildings.
No, I said on that question of linking valuation, at the end of the day, as you know, as a surveyor, you know, valuers need market evidence. They need to see the market rewarding buildings with higher rental values, with higher cap values to then relate the valuation to its sort of ESG type credentials. So that the more we can measure buildings, the more we can make those correlations and those causations. But it's very hard unless we have the data, isn't it, to show these real correlations. So that's the challenge.
And, you know, and as I say, we're all on this journey where we are, you know, within the industry, trying to figure out how to use these measurements in order to feed into valuation models, feed into management of the asset, feed into the design, feed back into design processes as well. And this is going to take a few years to figure out, but I think it's very telling that if you look at sort of banks who are interested in financing improvements in housing, is it green finance packages?
Yeah,
there's a lot of interest in how you might be able to measure the available uplift from an improvement. You know, and an EPC gives you some chance of getting at that, and it's the first step on the pathway. But I think there's a scope to get a good deal better than that.
Exactly. We did touch on it earlier, and it's a point I always like to highlight, because although I talked about the edge, and we can all think of examples of relatively newly built, very, very smart buildings. Obviously, we are in a situation, if we just look at commercial real estate, where the majority of the stock we need to manage and improve is already built and is not built to be smart buildings. They're what you might rudely call dumb buildings. So I guess an interesting question for me to you is, from a data and tech perspective, what tools do we have to work with these, dare I say it rather rudely, less bright buildings that are out in the regional cities? They're out in, you know, in cities around the UK and around the world. They're already being built. They have to be worked with rather than knocked down and replaced by some, you know, wonderful new smart building. That the reality is, whether it's 80-90% of the stock is that kind of profile, isn't it?
It is. Buildings that need further education, maybe.
Yes. Lifelong learning for buildings.
And this is, I mean, really, that's what we at Purrmetrix are after. You know, this is the sort of building where the other thing about them is, because they don't necessarily have a particularly high value associated with contracts with them, you can't afford to be overhauling them and sticking 15,000–20,000 pounds worth of monitoring kit in. So, you know, really what's helpful here is both the tools that can be used to produce some basically benchmark data, and that's those sorts of things are, in our case, a set of environmental sensors, communications platform, data platform to make sense of it. Those are retrofittable and easy to take in, move in and out of buildings, because there's a fair amount of people who are building or people who are using existing data sources in buildings, or trying to improve data sources in buildings, or trying to improve, the BMS, for example. In our experience in lower value buildings, that those data sources tend to be, frankly, a bit rubbish. for various reasons, and it's difficult to do sort of reliable data science on those. So we're trying to produce a solution that works well across the installed base of buildings.
Yeah. Now, and I suppose it leads me to my last question, which is hopefully a positive one, in the sense that, do you think this whole kind of focus on the building management and performance and the metrics is helping the general kind of path of getting digital data sets on buildings in a better shape? Because I don't think we start from a great place, do we, in terms of having, as you said, reasonable based data that's held in some form that is able to be analysed and to drive sensible decisions? Because obviously at one extreme you've got wonderful digital twins fully visualised on these smart buildings, but even at the other direction you'd hope, can we begin to build on that road to digitization some reasonably structured data that says, well, here's the building, this is the size of it, and this is our energy consumption, and this is the feedback from the tenants in terms of their happiness with it, etc., etc. Do you think we're on a positive trajectory there in terms of getting better data, even for these, as you say, pre-existing, less exciting assets, if I can call them that?
Oh, absolutely, yes. There is much better data availability now, and a lot of the conversations I hear about opening up existing data silos, like for example the data behind the EPCs, leads me to be very, very hopeful about how that's going to be done. There is, with the legacy data, I fear there's going to be a few years of figuring out what legacy data is worth working with and what is.
Yes, exactly. Just leave it. Yes.
But the very fact that people are now aware of just of how this can work and are beginning to develop the business cases for doing it makes me very optimistic that we're going to get some good results out of that, and probably sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's funny. I was at an event yesterday, actually, in central London, and a very long-standing member was talking about his work with various asset managers and how they were beginning to actually explicitly reserve a little bit of the top-line income for all their assets in this whole agenda, that they recognise that they can't just, as you said, let the asset waste each year. They've got to reinvest a small percentage each year just to make these kind of marginal gains, these improvements, and recognise that from that point of view, they have this responsibility to channel some of the money back into that asset management in its most literal form. So hopefully there is a long journey ahead, but hopefully it's heading in the right direction. So
it's all the tools are there. Some of them we need to do a little bit more cost engineering on, and in some cases we probably that will be driven by a better, more clarity for the specific business cases. And I suspect that if you look at where we are compared to someone like Demand Logic, for example, that's two very different business cases for using what is essentially different applications of sensing technology. But the marketplace is beginning to give both businesses the actual ROI for using this stuff. So now we have the ability to diverge and to build the tool sets that are helpful for either scenario, whether you want to just close the control loop and run a particular type of this building as efficiently as possible, or whether you want to go through an audit and actually be able to deliver some metrics of performance for your maintenance scheme, or for your productivity audit, or your energy efficiency audit. So it's horses for courses, but as long as we're developing a business case for it, and I think we're going to see much more efficient use and much more creative use of the data sets that we have got out there.
Well, that's great to hear. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and been great to talk, Hermione. I look forward to talking to you again in 2022.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been great to be on the show, and I look forward to talking again.